Hello and welcome to the Gaming Annex of the Comics, of course, Justin. So, another week, another story. This one comes out of PlayStation. A lot of talk on PlayStation. They got Marathon coming out from Bungie. Helldivers 2 is still being Helldivers 2. But not all is rosy in the land of squares and triangles, I guess. Because apparently, news has broken recently that dynamic pricing is, and again, this comes from an article from PSU, dynamic pricing is reportedly being tested by Sony on the PS5's PlayStation Store. This is from March 9th. So, story goes that apparently they have begun testing out dynamic pricing on the PS5 section of the PlayStation Store, with price changes having been detected across more than 100 games by Tracker PS pricing, including personalized discounts of up to 17.6% offered to users. Now, dynamic pricing, and this is me quoting the article here, is employed by companies to set flexible pricings for products that are based on demand. My brain died there. Let me say that again. That are based on demand or decided by the unique purchase history of a consumer. I hate that word, but basically it's supply and demand, right? The more people buy, the more expensive something becomes, vice versa. We'll talk more about that later. Tracker reveals that some PlayStation Store users have been met with personalized pricing that is positioned much lower than the standard price point, which is part of Sony's attempt to study demand elasticity, which is basically financial talk for how much people are willing to pay for something. Sony's process of A/B price testing has been going on for at least 3 months, according to this article, across 30 different regions, and has expanded to nearly 70 regions now, including Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. My guess is the US and Canada may be on that list, maybe not. First-party games like Gran Turismo 7, God of War Ragnarok, Marvel's Spider-Man 2, and The Last of Us Part 2 have been included in discounts between 5 to, again, the aforementioned 17.6% as part of this process. So, what does that mean? This is where we talk about the personal side of things. I'm deeply concerned. Let me just start off by saying that. Yes, on the surface, this does seem like a good thing, right? You're getting discounts because you might not purchase as much, or the game might not be doing so hot. On the surface, it doesn't seem that bad. But when you extrapolate this, it also means kind of the possible other side of the coin, right? Prices might go down, but they might also go up. Because again, price elasticity, as I previously mentioned, is just them measuring how much you as a customer are willing to pay for the games. So if you're willing to pay more, they'll drive the price up.
Go and change it on you.
And they might, they've already changed it on you, but they might just drive that price up instead of down. Arguably, you could say the games industry already did this with the launch of the PS5 consoles and Nintendo with the launch of the Switch 2. Prices went up by $10 for it's the industry themselves kind of already admitted no other reason than because new consoles came out. I personally don't see a reason for prices to go up beyond, graphics getting better, which is just a natural progression of graphics engines. I mean, you could make an argument there that, inflation, yada, 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 yada. But I'm not going to entertain much of that conversation because that's a whole other can of worms. Suffice to say, yes, prices have indeed gone up to match inflation. You, as the customer, probably just not have noticed it because, look at a game you buy these days. When was the last time you bought a game that was just a game for a flat price? That was just it. It's not just, hey, there's the game, but also there's the bonus edition and the deluxe edition and the collector's edition that are worth 3 different prices. One of them vastly more inflated than the other and chopped out bits of DLC, possibly extra stuff that you have to, buy the better editions to get. Ubisoft, I'm looking at you.
Ubisoft.
Stuff like that kind of result in you buying the more expensive editions than the base game, which themselves may not have changed up until, the recent generation. So, long story short, have prices gone up to match inflation? Yes, they just haven't gone up as a flat rate. They've gone up in the form of, bonus versions, extra editions, yada, yada, yada. So I'm not just going to entertain that argument because that's a whole other coin. But suffice to say, that's where I stand on the issue. But again, this seems to be them further testing the pricing of how much people will pay for it, right? Like, will people pay for lower prices? And I personally don't care too much for the idea because this, like I said, could result in you as the customer paying more than the guy beside you just because you might be willing to spend a bit more than the guy beside you. This kind of also doesn't make sense because most of this process of supply and demand, has to factor in supply, which is a little bit of a moot and stupid point to make as far as the electronics and internet world is concerned, because as anyone who's followed the whole story of NFTs back in the day knows, there's really not much of there's really not much of a quote unquote supply side of the internet, right? When you make something on the internet, that thing is there and can then be copied at infinitum by
So
as
so
many people.
long as it exists somewhere long enough, a copy of it will be made and a copy of it will be propagated.
Yeah, and it's not even will be made; it's just can be made, right? Like supply and demand work in the real world, and for those who aren't aware, price elasticity and dynamic pricing is actually something that does actually happen in stores quite often. It's something that happens, for example, on a regional level with things like groceries, right? Supply and demand change based on where, for example, a fruit is grown, how easy it is to get there, how in season is it, so how rare is the fruit at that current moment, things like that cause the price to go up or down respectively, right? Because you got to factor in things like growing, transport, how often is the fruit getting available, stuff like that, which drives the price up and down of production. But as previously mentioned, with the internet, beyond the price and cost it takes to make that thing for the first time, no further cost beyond, I guess, maybe storage fees of the servers it's held on come into account. And those are flat rates, so unless you count power bills, which I mean, then you're, I guess, splitting hairs at that point. Like ultimately, supply and demand aren't really a factor on the internet because, like I said, as anyone who was in the NFT boom back in the day knows, you were as following that mess of a story from back in the day knows. There's not really such a thing as scarcity on the internet, right? Supply factors in concepts like scarcity, which doesn't really exist. Once something is made, it can again be copied at infinitum as many times as you need, and well, scarcity doesn't really exist at that point, then, does it? So, taking the counts of supply and demand in on the internet is kind of a stupid moot point, because at that point, it's just artificial price fixing. Because, again, as I said at the very beginning, prices went up when the console generation changed from 4 to 5 or from Switch 1 to Switch 2 or whatever metric you're using to judge generations. And the only reason they did it was because, and I kid you not, I gotta see if I can dig up this very old article. It's from way back in like the mid 2000s. But I remember hearing someone, I think at like EA or Activision, admitting that they were just looking for an excuse, or maybe early 2010s, I don't know. Been a long time since the article came out, where they were basically admitting that they were just kind of looking for an excuse to drive up the prices. They don't need much of a reason as far as the internet is concerned. Because, like I said, supply and demand aren't an issue here because where there is a supply, there will be a demand. It's just the nature of things, and scarcity doesn't, factor in because, well, we just explained why. And so changing the consoles over from, in this case, Gen 4 to Gen 5 is a perfect excuse to say, and everything's now $10 more. Why? Just because we said so, you know? Nintendo's a perfect example of this kind of logic. I always like to joke sometimes that Nintendo fanboys are in an abusive relationship with Nintendo because Nintendo does some very scummy things. Let's be honest here. And you just kind of have to put up with it when you're in Nintendo. Like, for example, when Switch 2 came out, right? In Canada, Switch games went from like 79, 69 bucks, basically prices of games on the regular consoles, to 90, to $100. They went up from 70, $80 to 100. That is a $20 jump just because the console changed over. And I'm sure Nintendo could come out here and say, well, the hardware is better and we're using better chips and blah 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 blah. But here's the thing: some Nintendo Switch 2 games are actually not even held on the cartridge anymore. They're just a game
It's a
key, which is
key.
effectively, yeah, it's just a license on a cartridge, which is probably just a line of text and code saying you may download this, which then allows you to go to the server and then download that thing locally. The cartridge is effectively useless. It's just there to have effectively a. You're, you're not buying a game copy, you're buying a lease at that point. You're buying a document. That's about it. Which then allows you to download the game. Which again shoots this whole concept of supply and demand in the foot.
So that
Because that because that just shows you that you don't even need to sell games on the things you're actually selling to sell games anymore. Remember back in the day with the Game Boy and stuff like that, where if you wanted to sell games, the game had to actually be in the fucking cartridge? Nowadays, that isn't even a thing anymore. The internet shall provide. So, again, scarcity just doesn't really exist. And they drove up the price by $20. I'm surprised anyone even buys those things anymore. I'm sure, like, and that's the thing. If you want to buy Nintendo, you just kind of have to put up with the pricing. I'm surprised those things don't go down. Like, the only time
See,
I buy a Switch 2 game,
quick side note. In the
hmm,
past, when it came to Nintendo consoles, a lot of the time, especially during the DS era, when a new console came out, older console games would go and become slightly cheaper, not by much, but a little cheaper in order to maybe get rid of some of the excess supply that they have, because eventually, obviously, like DS games now and all that don't get made anymore. I don't think they do anything DS related period anymore.
maybe in Japan, but that's a side note.
That's a side note. Needless to say, though, like eventually it gets to a point where like
They cease production.
they cease production and they move on. So that's the thing when it comes to Nintendo. A lot of the time they eventually went and discounted kind of some of their games, the older generation games, in order to incentivize people to go and get them, and that way they're gone and they get rid of it.
They're an old stock.
Yeah, clear out stock and move on to the next product. So, yeah, just
Yeah,
quick side note.
yeah, that's kind of the thing, right? Like ultimately, you nowadays you just kind of need to provide someone a license on a card in the case of some games on the Switch 2, and then the internet will just download it to you. So you don't really need to worry about things like shipping, supply, and all that stuff. And again, Nintendo just jacked up the price by $20 because they just felt like, sure, why not, right? It's not like the only thing that got better as far as the thing was concerned was the Switch 2 hardware. And if you really want to talk economics here, that does not justify an increase in the game's pricing because game pricing is split between, or profits, excuse me, are split between Nintendo and the publisher dash developer, with most of it going to probably the publisher, obviously going to the publisher and developer. Switch 2 and Switch Nintendo just takes a cut because they run the platform. If you want to talk profitability of the Switch 2 and justifying its better hardware, that's on the Switch 2 on a hardware sales side. What sells hardware is the hardware itself ultimately, and maybe game exclusives, but that's neither here nor there. So ultimately, that doesn't factor in. So why did they drive up the price? Just because they felt like they needed to, really. And this is nothing new for Nintendo. Likely, Nintendo has always done what Nintendo wants. It's just Nintendo for you. But again, this comes back to the grander point of it feels rather scummy because, like I said, when you talk dynamic pricing on the internet, it just sounds to me like price fixing at that point. Like I say, you get $20 and you pay $50 because you don't spend as much and he spends more, so he can afford 50 because I think he can afford 50. See the point here? When we talk gaming often, we talk about, what's the market price? What's the standard going rate for games? And it has always been. What's the flat rate? $80, $70, depending on your region. But now, with dynamic pricing, if this catches on, that goes out the window entirely. You know? What's the standard pricing? Well, it's whatever the computer thinks you will pay, which at that point is really stupid because, yeah, sure, as it currently stands, you might get lucky and get a discount because you don't spend as much, which, yeah, sure, that's good. But like I said at the very beginning of this episode, it's good when it comes only as a form of a discount. But what happens when it starts manifesting in the form of price inflation instead of deflation? What then? Instead of paying $50 flat rate, you're paying $70 flat rate because computer thinks you'll pay it.
Yeah, and
What happens then?
that's where like a major problem starts coming in is the fact that okay, you don't you wish list one of these games, you wait like a couple months, you see that you get a discount because you haven't paid for any games or even bought anything for a while. Meanwhile, your friend who has bought like two or three games during that time doesn't get the discount or worse has to pay an extra like 5 or $10.
That's the thing, right? That's kind of the malicious side of things. And that's kind of why I said at the very beginning as well, price price elasticity does exist in business, and ultimately supply and demand and the concept of individualized pricing, or at the very least generalized pricing, does exist in things like grocery, because like I said, on a regional level, depending on how rare something is and how hard it is to make, will depend on how expensive that thing is. For example, if I want a, I don't know, an orange from Florida, chances are it's going to cost me a lot more to get that thing in Canada than it is in, Florida, where I could just pick it off a tree.
Just a bit.
So that makes sense in those terms because, like I said, there's a lot of things you have to factor in there. And even then, those kinds of pricings aren't individualized, they're regional generally, because, shipping something to a singular region generally means that will be the pricing. How much you go to the grocery store isn't going to change how much the, price of bread is. But in this case, it's individualized, which throws everything out of whack because, like I said, doesn't really make sense when you consider the fact that, scarcity doesn't exist on the internet. So what's the point of inflating or deflating pricing beyond juicing more money out of people? Which, let's be honest, this is exactly what this is for, just to juice more money out of you, really. It's to benefit them, not you. And again, it doesn't really make it's also just kind of scummy because again, your buddy might be paying $50 for a game, but you might be paying 75 because computer just thinks you'll pay it. So what happens then? And it throws the concept of standard pricing for games. What's the going rate? Completely out of whack because that means the going rate is really whatever the computer says for you is the going rate, which is completely ridiculous. Which also opens up the door to people gaming the system, but that's neither here nor there. And also the concept of sales just going completely out the window because that means there's no such thing as a Christmas sale anymore, or a generalized sale, or if there is, those sales will vary depending on who you are, which wouldn't it be really shitty to try and buy Christmas games on someone like Steam for your buddy, and instead of like getting 40% off or 50% off, you're only all out a 20% off discount because computer says you'll think you'll buy it? You know? Uh, no, no, no. Anyways, that's this week's episode. Interesting stuff to talk about. Figured that we'd bring this to your attention because if this catches on, no bueno for the games industry. Though, considering it's PlayStation doing it, well, PlayStation has gotten very greedy as of lately, so... Yeah, PlayStation and Xbox, especially PlayStation, have gotten rather greedy as of late. Xbox is off in the corner tweaking over AI, which... other story. Not doing so well for them either, though. And Nintendo, like I said in the show, is just doing Nintendo things, and we all begrudgingly love them for it. So, that's this week's episode. Hope you all enjoyed. Hope you all found it informative, and see you all next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Have a good one.